Well, thank you so much, Ken, for joining me today on the WaveCapital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment. You are my 66th guest. How are you today, Ken?
I'm doing well, Garrett. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for joining me today. And you're the national political reporter at the Wall Street Journal. You've been there for nearly 7 years. And before that, you spent almost a 20-year career at the Associated Press. Ken, when you think of relationship building in a team environment, what does relationship building mean to you? And what has it meant for your professional career?
Yeah, it's great to be with you, Garrett. I think over the course of my career, when I think of team building and relationship building, I think of words like trust and consistency. I think that you always want to have a sense within, the group that you're working with that there's an open door, that they can, share their views, whether they are, the youngest member of the team or the oldest, the most experienced, the least experienced. And I think the thing with journalism is that, this just having worked in TV, it's really a team sport. You cannot accomplish all that you need to accomplish as a journalist, as a reporter, without the help of editors, without the help of colleagues who, maybe have a certain skill set that you don't. I just think about how much journalism has changed during the course of my career. And, I started out at a small newspaper in Charleston, West Virginia. It was a PM newspaper, meaning we, would get up at the crack of dawn, and we had an opportunity till about 9 in the morning to actually get something new into the paper. The paper would be delivered around lunchtime, and then people would get it delivered in their mailboxes in the evening, the early evening around dinner time. And you just, back then, you just had the phone, and, we had basic computers. And now I think about what I do, I do podcasts. I do TV hits. I was just working on a video piece with my colleagues here at the Journal, that's going to air soon. And, I'm writing and reporting, but so much of what we have done is changed over the years. And so you really, to make all of those trains run, to make everything work, you have to empower people. And I think they need to know that you're steady, that you're consistently there, and that you are, willing to be an honest broker. And so I think that's what I always try to foster when I'm in a team setting. And, I think that consistency serves you well over time.
Yes, and you have not only worked at the Wall Street Journal, and that's where you are currently, you also worked for the Associated Press after your time in Charleston, West Virginia. And working at the Associated Press nearly 20 years, talk to me about how your career started. You mentioned Charleston, West Virginia, but the majority of your career has been at the AP. So talk to me about how or what it's been like covering, major stories in politics, covering different presidential administrations, and seeing the life cycle of journalism in the realm of politics and covering stories and being on deadline, breaking news. What excites you, and what has the evolution of our industry, journalism, what has that meant to you from a relationship building standpoint, covering these breaking news stories in politics?
Yeah. Well, I think I've worked in DC now for 20 years, and my sense is that people either start out in DC as very young reporters and stay there their entire careers and sort of move up the food chain, or they do something similar to what I did, which is I, started out at a small newspaper in Charleston, the Charleston Daily Mail. I worked there for a year, and then I got into Columbia Journalism School in New York. I did that for a year, and as that year was wrapping up, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do next. I had some interviews with papers in the Northeast, but I had an adjunct professor who had worked for the Associated Press, and she said, you should really think about it. I think you'd be good at it. and I was able to, take a test. I don't know if they still do it now, but they have this test that they would administer to go work for the AP, and then they gave me an opportunity to start out in Des Moines, Iowa. It was a very entry level job. It was actually a temporary job when I took it. And so I had never been to Iowa. I didn't really know anyone out there. But what I did know was that it was the summer of 1999, and they were getting ready for the caucuses. And I knew I wanted to be a political reporter, and I wanted to be part of that process. So, I just packed up and moved out there. And it's really one of the best decisions I ever made. I got a permanent job, within a few months. Someone left, and they gave me that promotion. But I also just got to work with just some terrific reporters, both within the AP, but also just within the larger press corps. Mike Glover is someone you probably know. He was AP's political reporter in Des Moines. He covered national politics. So he was attached to Al Gore at that time, and so I would sort of cover a lot of the lesser known candidates in that field. I covered Bill Bradley. I remember covering Pat Buchanan, for example. People like that who, Alan Keyes, Steve Forbes. These were people who they weren't necessarily going to challenge George W. Bush for the nomination in the Republican Party. Bradley, was the main contender against Gore. But I got to see on the ground, how a caucus works. And so, that was just invaluable. Jeff Zeleny of CNN was a reporter at the Des Moines Register at the time. We've known each other a long time. My Wall Street Journal colleague, John McCormick, veteran of the Chicago Tribune, he was there as well. So like we were all like in our 20s, covering the caucuses. And, I think all of us just feel like that was just a really formative experience. While I was there, I also got to cover the legislature. I spent a couple of years there covering the legislative session. And, there are just people, Tom Vilsack was the governor at the time. I've known him forever now. He served 2 tours as agriculture secretary. There are legislators who were there at the time who, I'm still in contact with. So I did that for a couple years, and then I got an opportunity to get a promotion within the AP. They had an opening for a political reporter in Miami. And so I decided to move to Miami. Again, I really didn't know anybody in Miami. I had spent a little time in Florida, but not a lot. And so I went down there, and at the time, Florida was like this quintessential swing state. It was this place, I moved there right after the 2000 recount. It was this almost holy ground of political activity. And so, there was a governor by the name of Jeb Bush at the time who was, had a pretty interesting profile. His older brother was the president. So it was just a fascinating place to cover politics. And the crazy thing now is with the Trump presidency, you just see how influential Florida is, in this administration. I mean, Marco Rubio was just getting started while I was down there. He was in the state legislature. He's now the Secretary of State. I mean, I knew of Susie Wiles. I knew of Brian Ballard. I mean, these were all people who, were ensconced in local Republican politics at the time, and now have, huge roles, in this administration, outside the administration. And so, I did that I was there about 5 years. And again, it's just like there are people I'm still in contact with, donors. There are a lot of financial donors for both parties who live in Florida. Those are people who I've known, and so I did that for a stint, and then I had an opportunity to come to Washington again for the Associated Press. They moved me up here to cover the Michigan congressional delegation. It was at the time there were these regional jobs within the AP where you would cover a delegation, a part of the country. And so my role was covering the Michigan congressional delegation, but also the auto industry, a highly regulated industry. And so I happened to be covering it when 2008 rolled around and the economy was in tatters, and General Motors and Ford, needed this government support to stay alive. And that was just a fascinating story, and one that I'll really never forget. And from there I just sort of moved into national politics. So I was in probably my mid 30s or so when I started covering national politics. I've covered every presidential campaign now since 2012, and what I tend to do is cover a campaign and then cover policy or a White House, something the new administration is doing, and I tend to just sort of toggle back between campaigns and governing. Sometimes it involves the White House. I've covered parts of the Obama White House. I covered the first 2 years of the first Trump White House, and then I had covered all 4 years of the Biden White House. And now I'm covering a lot of covering the Trump administration, but from more of an administration standpoint, just looking at DOGE, the impact of the Trump policies that we've seen so far, the efforts to, cut the government, so all of these things I think build upon themselves. And I think the lesson here in terms of relationship building is just that, that person you meet in Iowa, could be like the White House chief of staff someday. In Iowa especially. I mean, David Plouffe, Jen Psaki, I mean, David Axelrod. These are all people who are really well known. They've all had huge roles in government, on TV, whatever. And these are all people like, we knew when we were covering the caucuses, just because that was our job. So I think the lesson is just to, be that consistent person, be that person that, they can know and trust. And I think that serves you well as you, move up in your career.
Well, what's extraordinary is that, and thank you so much for me and my audience at home, my viewers, my listeners, to hear how your career has evolved, in the last 30 plus years. And you speak of all these names, and these are people who have, like you said, big positions at national networks, or who have served in the White House, in different presidential administrations. And I can tell by your tone and your candor and your really detailed insight into all of these stops that all these people have made, including you, where they began in Iowa covering the caucuses. And you mentioned people like David Axelrod or Jeff Zeleny or Jen Psaki, or people who have really blossomed in their careers like you have. And it's great that you could pick up a phone and reach out to him or her and say, hey, what have you been up to? What stories are you covering? How are your families? How are the kids? Right? You can really pick up where you left off. And that's really what relationship building is all about, because it's not where you start, it's where and not just where you finish. It's really a continuation throughout your career, professionally and even in your personal life, depending on who you're close to, that you're able to just pick up where you left off, and it's like nothing ever changed. And I think that
Yeah.
in the business that you're in, where sources matter, when you're covering stories, when you're covering different facets of political life, whether, to your point, whether you're covering an administration from afar, or you're covering the White House specifically, or covering, gubernatorial campaigns, or, you mentioned how Marco Rubio, now Secretary of State, former U.S. Senator Marco Rubio, how he got started in the Florida legislature. Talk about the Florida recount, which, Vice President Gore and, Governor Bush then became President Bush. The Florida recount, who could forget that? And
Yeah.
I live in Florida. I'm in Central Florida. I'm in Orlando. And I remember as a young kid at the time, I was 12, but that Florida recount is etched in my mind, knowing when my parents were talking about it, or next door neighbors, or just hearing about it in school. Everybody was looking to Florida about the Florida recount and how that delayed the presidential transition, from Clinton to Bush. And that's another topic for another day. But just how you can speak about, even though you work at the Wall Street Journal and people look at the journal as it leans a little bit more conservatively or traditionally more conservative, and not so much of a more liberal leaning publication. Just reading your background and learning more about you through the articles that I've read, the stories that you've covered, you're very fair and balanced. And I can tell, just having been associated with Democrats and Republicans, you're an old school journalist, somebody who is fair, and somebody who covers a story, and somebody who, yeah, you're going to be opinionated when you can be opinionated, be neutral when you're going to be neutral. But I can just tell that having listened to you and the people that you've come across, and you speak so highly of them, that it doesn't matter whether you work for a left wing or right wing publication. Journalists are journalists, and our profession is that we call balls and strikes no matter what person, wherever they lie and on the political spectrum, depending on the political aisle, it doesn't matter. So where do you feel that it was a pivotal moment for you in your career? Because you speak about all these different opportunities that you've had and all these different stops that you've made, and your career, from 30,000 feet above, taking a bird's eye view, looking at your career. Where do you feel like it's been a pivotal moment for you where you say, you know what, if this didn't happen, I wouldn't be here today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I just think of the people who acted as mentors to me, the people who I got to work with when I was younger, who were, very much at the top of their game. And, I think about, as you were talking, I was thinking about Ron Fournier. So Ron was AP's chief political writer. He had, just an amazing journalism career. He covered Bill Clinton in Arkansas when Clinton was governor, and then moved from Little Rock up to DC to cover the administration. And, I got to work for Ron, and one of the things that he used to tell me about source building, for example, is that you want to meet somebody and not necessarily like try to extract any big news out of them the first time you meet them. So he would just meet people, and he'd want to know about their families, of their backgrounds, why they got into politics. And the one thing he used to always do, and he used to tell us to do, is he would then send a handwritten note with his business card in the mail to the person after they met. And it's a little old fashioned, right? But it was something, it was a way to say to people, I value you, I want to get to know you. And then, you build that relationship, and then that's when the scoops come later, that you don't feel the need to like give someone the third degree the first time that you meet them. You just try to get to know them. And that's something I've tried to do. But working with people like Ron, working with people like Mike Glover, working just with people who had been through national campaigns before, that was something I was interested in doing. I remember like being around like someone like Ron Brownstein, who at the LA Times at the time, you see him on CNN. He was somebody who was in Iowa a lot covering the caucuses, and I remember sitting down with him and Ron Fournier once. Just being around those people was just really helpful. And I think you could sort of see the trajectory that they had laid out in their careers. You could see, well, maybe I could do that too. And the advice I got was just to try to go to states where there were big races. So like when I was in the process of getting the job in Florida and Miami, another opportunity opened up, but it wasn't going to be, the same echelon of politics, as what I was going to get in Florida. So, I always just felt like if you could try to be on the ground covering, the big races, or be in a state that really matters, that would be meaningful. And actually, that's what I really try to do now, when I'm covering politics. If I go to a state where maybe I don't know a lot of people, I don't have a ton of sources, I always just try to get coffee with, the person who runs the local Democratic Party, or the person maybe who's like the state director for a senator, or somebody who's been a campaign manager in that state before, run statewide campaigns. I just always try to like have a list of people in as many states as possible who I can call, after the fact, if something's going on, and I need to find out, well, what's really happening here? What's happening with this this member of Congress who's under investigation? What's going on in this? Is this person about to retire, and who's going to run for that seat if that person retires? You just need to build, Rolodex is sort of an old school term, but you need to build that Rolodex of people who can help you, see around the curve, and understand, really where a story's going. And so I always just, if I'm in that state, I travel a lot. If I'm in that state, I just try to get a beer with that person, a coffee, even if it's just a half an hour, or just introduce myself and get to know them. Because there's this line that you hear a lot, that Washington is always the last place to get the news. That we are always, sometimes we don't see the trends in Washington because it's all happening out across the country. And that was a big, I think, a big criticism of the rise of Trump in 16, that a lot of people didn't see it coming, so to speak. They didn't understand the sort of the power and the clout. And you could say the same thing about the Tea Party, for example. And so I think, as a reporter, you just have to get out of Washington as much as you can, get on the ground. But I think just being around those people, having those mentors, that probably was meaningful to me, and meant more to my career, more than anything, really.
Well, it's interesting. A couple things, and then I'll ask my next question. When I had Chuck Todd on my podcast, the former moderator for NBC News' Meet the Press, and he was a chief White House correspondent for NBC News, and former political director for NBC. He felt that, and to put it in the right context, he feels that Silicon Valley is more out of touch, let's say, than Washington. He said Washington, and not to, or trying to go back, and for what Chuck said, is that Washington is more in touch, he feels, than the rest of the country. So what you're saying, although it might sound like the opposite, I think I understand your point as well, is that if Washington is the last place to get news because there's more going on outside of Washington, I guess it really depends on, what that news is, or in the context, because everybody,
Yeah.
whether it's you or Chuck Todd or others, are going to have their own opinions, his or own opinions. And when you mentioned the Tea Party movement, I remember when I was, my social media post was featured on Michael Smerconish's show, Smerconish, on CNN, and he read my tweet, or now X, formerly Twitter, and he read it on his show. And I had talked about in my social media post that I think that there was going to be an evolutionary phenomenon, if you will, with the Democratic Party and the Republican Party after this past 2024 election. And this was back, last summer. And Michael felt that it's going to be interesting. At the time, he was thinking it'll be interesting if the MAGA movement outlasts Trump, which he felt it would. If Trump had not won, he still felt the movement would survive. And he thought it was interesting just based upon his reaction, because when I had drawn the idea that the Democratic Party would also evolve, not just the Republican Party, he found that to be very intriguing and clever, I think. And so, with your career covering all these different administrations, and seeing the rise of the Tea Party movement during the Bush years, and seeing that traditional conservatism is again, I'll reference Chuck again in my interview with him. He was reminding me, and because you're an historian too, like Chuck, that the traditional Republican movement or traditional conservative presidential administration from, let's say, Dwight D. Eisenhower to George W. Bush, that's just a small segment or a small sample size of the Republican Party going back to Abraham Lincoln, when Abraham Lincoln was our first Republican president. And that really, that Trump, since he's been in office his first term and now his second term with the Biden years in between, but that Trump is showing signs of what perhaps was a Republican type of administration, maybe back in the 1800s, post Abraham Lincoln. But in Trump's, I guess, his way of looking at how to run the country with American first policies and expansionism, which expansionism was popular in the 1800s, post Lincoln, mid 1800s, post Civil War, Reconstruction era. Although, to Chuck's point, using the word imperialism, that Trump kind of has an imperialistic viewpoint. So I wanted to, because I'm interviewing you, I wanted to get your thoughts on that, covering the Trump administration and covering just also the Biden years, and really going back, in your career, the evolution that you've seen covering politics. And, would you prefer covering the White House more than, let's say, a campaign? Do you find it more fascinating to cover maybe a campaign more than the White House? Would love your thoughts on all that.
Yeah, I enjoy the ability to cover a campaign and then cover the consequences of what I followed during a campaign in an administration. So it can be in the White House, it can be outside the White House, but I always find it, helpful to just, be on the trail, covering a candidate, understanding what is motivating voters. What are the issues where a candidate is really connecting on, and then how that candidate, if the person actually gets elected, how that person then brings those policies and puts them into effect. I think that there's a real benefit to having covered both administrations, both Republican and Democratic. I think about what those first 2 years of covering Trump was like. There was so much sort of outside energy, I think, in those years. I think no one had seen a candidate like Trump. He was really the first non-elected official we'd had in the White House since Eisenhower, and really, he, I don't know that Trump and Eisenhower are exactly corollaries here. I mean, we had really never seen someone like Trump seize the mantle of the Republican Party from the outside, and then take those ideas into the White House and put together a team. I mean, I think what's been so striking in this second Trump term compared to the first was just the types of people who he has in these roles. In the first go around, it was like he was getting more establishment Republicans in some of these positions. You think of Rex Tillerson, for example, a business guy, ExxonMobil, as Secretary of State. And Tillerson is really not someone we're seeing in this second go around. There were a lot of more establishment figures in the first Trump administration. And now I think, there are more people who are really just from the sort of MAGA wing of the party. Pete Hegseth, for example, I think someone who Trump really viewed as very like-minded. And you compare that to Biden, which was very much, I think, an attempt by Democrats to sort of return some of the norms that they felt had been lost during the Trump years. And, Biden, was someone who was really, as someone, from a coverage standpoint, just the antithesis of Trump. He was someone who spent decades in the Senate. He very much understood the inside game of the Senate. He had that role within the Foreign Relations Committee when he was in the Senate, so he traveled widely. Of course, he also ran the Judiciary Committee. So, we all remember, the Bork hearings, the Clarence Thomas hearings, and then he was vice president. And so, he was just someone who had all of these relationships and had, decades of experience. And so, that was fascinating to watch. And I think now, in the aftermath of Biden within the Democratic Party, I think what we're going to see as we move into the midterms and sort of start the 2028 process is, instead of maybe a moderate versus liberal tug of war within the party, I think it's going to be more about inside and outside, more about sort of the insider figures within the party and how they think things should go, people who are, in the Senate, people who've been elected for years and have sort of that inside knowledge versus the outsiders. And I think, you're going to see a lot of governors run for president who are going to come at it from a much different vantage point as someone who's run a state outside of the confines of Washington. And I think you have to be open to the idea that there could be just, people who are not necessarily historically political running for president, people who are business people who, maybe are in media or, just have a different type of experience, because I think there's just going to be a real openness for new faces and new ideas in the Democratic Party. And so, just all of these have, these confluences of events that we've seen just have been fascinating to cover. When you think about where the country has gone from, when I started covering Barack Obama around 2011, that was in that Tea Party era. The Tea Party sort of started around 2009. It was in the aftermath of the downturn, the economic downturn, and how much our politics has shifted and changed, and the sort of the allegiance of voters has changed over that time to what we have now.
Well, it's very interesting you bring up that, because when you think about where the Republican Party is today, in some respects, you can say the MAGA movement for Trump is or has a stronghold on the party. But when we saw the broad coalition that the Democratic Party was priding itself on, with the rise of Kamala Harris as being the candidate after Biden stepped down and basically handed off the candidacy to Kamala, and she got the delegates and she's running against Trump. And whether you were a Bernie Sanders or whether you were a Liz Cheney, you had a broad coalition to get behind Kamala. And a lot of those Republicans from the Bush years, the Reagan years, whomever, had served in previous administrations, Republican administrations pre-Trump, who were supporting, or the majority of whomever were supporting Kamala, it still wasn't enough, as we saw it, because Trump was able to win back the White House. And so, do you feel that the broad coalition will be something that's embraced by the Democratic Party, in 2026, 7, and then gearing up for the 2028 election? Will the Republican Party try to develop a broad coalition themselves to try to repeat what they did in 2024 by taking back some of those Biden-Harris supporters from 2020 and develop a broad coalition themselves? And then you speak about outside influence, outside candidates, new faces. It's going to be I think, a back and forth tuggle, right? Back and forth, who's going to tip the scale in midterms and then the 2028 election, who's going to rise in their or in his or her respective party to be our next president. And if you're going to go back to what I had mentioned about Michael Smerconish's thought that the MAGA movement will outlast Trump, what will that look like? Will that mean that JD Vance will assume the mantle, or is it going to be somebody else from Trump's current administration second term? And what trends or what thoughts do you have, or what trends do you see rather, of where both parties are heading?
Yeah. So I think if you're writing about voting coalitions, this is a fascinating time, because I think Trump was very successful in kind of breaking up that Obama coalition that was formed back in 08 and 2012. You think about where Trump received support. I mean, he has certainly been able to get more working class support than we've seen Republicans in the past have gotten. We just got some of this data from Catalyst. They're one of the groups that really analyzed the voter file, and they found that Latino men, for example, that was an area where Trump did better. Trump, I think, showed some improvement among Black voters as well. And so for Democrats, I think part of their challenge will be to try to reassemble the coalition that has helped them over the years with Obama. I mean, these things always evolve and change. And so it's hard to expect a party to simply put together a voting coalition from 3 previous election cycles and that will work now. But, I think that's the key for them, I think, is to try to just bring back, the support that they lost to Trump, among some of these voting groups. But I think we have to remember, I think if there's been a fairly consistent part of our politics over the years has just been this idea of voter dissatisfaction with the status quo. And so you've just had a number of, quote unquote, change elections over a number of cycles. So, I think that is something that I think the Democrats I talk to feel should be helpful, at least in the midterms. The Republicans have a narrow majority in the House. I think Democrats generally feel good about their ability to win back the House. I think the Senate is a tougher nut to crack, just simply because of the seats that are going to be up in 26, and then the map. It's generally more of a conservative territory. So I think in terms of 2028, I mean, if there's one thing I've tried to gain over time is a sense of humility, that there are a lot of things that I don't know and are very hard to predict. But I think on the Democratic side, I don't think you're going out on a limb to say that this is likely to be a very large field, as it was in 2020. Remember those debates that they had where it was just like multiple stages of people and people who couldn't qualify for the debate because there were just so many people. I think you're likely to see a number of governors look at it, Governor Whitmer in Michigan, Governor Pritzker in Illinois, Beshear in Kentucky, Shapiro in Pennsylvania. I think several senators, I think you have to think about as potential candidates. I think, Cory Booker is someone who ran before, Amy Klobuchar, Chris
Governor
Murphy.
Westmore in Maryland.
Yeah, Governor Westmore, great point, in Maryland. And, we're not even getting to Vice President Harris, who has a big decision to make. If she decides to run for governor of California, which, there's certainly signs that she may, she's going to have to make that decision, relatively soon, probably later in the summer. And then if she runs for governor, is that basically a decision to not run for president in 2028? If she's successful, if she runs for governor and succeeds, she'd be sworn in, around the beginning of 2027, which is right around the time that, a lot of people will be announcing their campaigns for president on the Democratic side. So, Harris, I think if you had an opinion poll, at this stage for 2028, she'd probably do pretty well and might be viewed as the leading contender because she ran the last time. But is she in this field potentially in 2028? It's hard to know. On the Republican side, I mean, I think who is the heir apparent to Trump? I mean, I think that is like the $64,000 question. I mean, I think Vance as his vice president, certainly could be viewed as the heir apparent, but there are a lot of other people in Trump's world. And I think, what Trump has taught us is that, it's possible for this outside force to become the leader of a party. So with all these things, we're like 3 years away. I always say, be humble. There's a lot we don't know. There's a lot of ground we got to cover before we get to that point.
Sure. And I think that if former Vice President Harris does run for the governor of California, And that would essentially give Gavin Newsom, who would be ending his
Yeah.
term, maybe he'll be a presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. I know that throughout his career, people have always hinted, or people have heard just internally his aspirations to become, a future president. And whether being a governor of California, which is the largest populated state in the country, overseeing 40 million Americans, 40 million residents, he has the type of role that is comparable to running for president, because California being the fourth largest economy in the world,
Yeah.
and by any estimation, it would be similar to running a small country.
Yeah,
Running,
he'd be formidable. And I think one thing that's been really interesting about these last few months is listening to Gavin Newsom's podcast. He's had a number of guests on from across the political spectrum. He certainly made news, in some of the early installments. But I think listening to that has been a really interesting window into how he is trying to sort of understand where the party is, where it's going. And I think all of these things could inform his decision, but certainly I think he's viewed as someone who is likely to run for president as well in 2028.
and I feel, and I believe rather, that there are people out there who are selling him short, because I think that and the same goes for former Vice President Harris, that to identify them as liberal Democrats in the state of California and in Trump's camp, or just in the conservative MAGA movement, just thinking of, oh, that's a state with sanctuary cities. That's a state where homelessness is or has been on the rise for many years. This is a state that is a welfare state. This is a state that, there's a lot of homelessness, and being a border state, oh, they don't enforce the borders in California, or they don't crack down on crime or things of that nature, or crack down on fentanyl. But California's problems are no different than the rest of the country's problems. You can look at Democratic states and you can look at Republican states, blue states, red states, even the purple swing states. All states, to a relative degree, have more or less the same problems. So that's where, as journalists, it's our responsibility, and it's your responsibility and your colleagues' responsibilities at the Wall Street Journal and other of your counterparts, whether the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Financial Times or the Los Angeles Times, whomever you work for, or whomever your employer is, whomever you represent on behalf of the publication, that you're reporting for, covering these stories. And it's the brand of journalism that you carry every day, when you're out there in the field. I wish that there wasn't so much of black and white, who's a journalist at this publication or who's a anchor at this cable network, because at the end of the day, you have to report the facts, and there are no such thing as alternative facts. As Kellyanne Conway had said to, again, I referenced Chuck Todd, in that segment, that Chuck said that has really stood the test of time, because I just feel that unlike a George W. Bush era, or unlike a George H.W. Bush presidency or Ronald Reagan presidency, and even presidencies before that, this movement that the Trump administration has presided over, the MAGA movement, if you will, you hear about in the news about, whether it's Harvard University, or whether it's NPR or Voice of America or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or you think about all these social programs that are really hanging in the balance rather, this big, beautiful bill that they're trying to get through Congress, passed in the House. They're now waiting for it to pass in the Senate. When you think about the most disadvantaged people, or the people who rely on food stamps, or people who rely on these social safety nets, they're going to be the ones who get hurt the most. And yes, I know Speaker Johnson was talking the other day with Jake Tapper at CNN about how, well, we have to see, of the undocumented immigrants, or people who are, illegally living in our country, who have access to these social safety net programs, and we have to weed them out, or just in other different categories. So that's why it relies on journalists like you to really break it down for everybody, to really, cover these stories and do it in such a informative, very detailed, very thorough, just really no sugarcoating, right? You just cover these stories. And I just feel that, the average everyday American voter, and not average in terms of intelligence, I don't mean that whatsoever. I mean in terms of how much are they really focusing or paying attention to the news cycle, because certain voter blocks, certain voters are just going to vote for the party, not so much think about who's leading that party. But this is where informed citizenry matters. It matters more than ever, because you can look to the Biden administration and maybe say, okay, their communications apparatus could have been so much better. They should have communicated their wins when legislation was passing. I mean, the Biden administration, probably the most consequential presidency of our lifetimes in modern history, because passing one key piece of legislation after another. And whether you agreed with the Biden era politics or not, just a very successful presidency in terms of passing legislation and signing into law. But whether it's Gavin Newsom or others speaking about the frailties of the administration, not communicating those wins, not having President Biden, former President Biden, be front and center, talking about in the White House press briefing room about how are these pieces of legislation, how is it affecting you every day? And yes, inflation's high, so having a answer to any reporter, or talking about with any constituency that represented by his fellow colleagues who he previously served in the Senate, who are still in the Senate, these people who represent their states, or these congresswomen who represent districts, making sure that they can carry that message back to their constituency and say, yes, although inflation is high, how is it going to help their wallets, not hurt their wallets? And just understanding where we came from during the Biden years, where the Trump years, mismanaging the COVID pandemic, interest rates were at near zero. It wasn't until Biden's second year in office that interest rates had to be raised by Fed Chair Jerome Powell to really balance, our, economy. And yes, extra stimulus was, offered in the Biden administration, which yes, did contribute to high inflation. But, coming out of a once in a 100-year pandemic, people were thinking, wow, prices were less during Trump's first term, and we had a strong economy, and we had low unemployment in the African American community, the Hispanic community. But if you look at Biden's record and the millions of jobs that were created, that were new jobs, the recovery jobs that were created, that really amounted to 16 million or so new jobs, and his record unemployment, that I think, if you ask anyone in the Biden camp, his unemployment numbers in some respects, depending on in what context or in what category, you can say rival the Trump administration, or even, exceed the Trump administration in terms of low unemployment. But again, people not appreciating, in my opinion, having to get through the pandemic, having to get those shots in everybody's arm when it came to eradicating COVID, and eradicating the deaths that our country was faced with on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis, right? And then having to deal with supply chain disruption, and getting our supply chains back in order, and then really touting the successes to the point where people felt that Biden or even Harris were in full control of the presidency, but then not feeling that this was all communicated to them, and then feeling that the Trump years, that they longed for, and then now that Trump's back in, he won back the White House, and then we're seeing the tariffs, and you've been covering a lot about the tariffs. You've been seeing how putting tariffs on 185 countries at one point, and then trying to negotiate through tariffs, which is the opposite of what Ronald Reagan had ever wanted to do. Ronald Reagan's on record saying that tariffs only work to a point in the short term, but in the long term, that's not how you negotiate foreign trade or foreign policy as it pertains to trade, rather. And then,
Well, I think we're living through the period that will inform the 2026 midterms right now. I mean, usually it's very hard for a White House to get much done, say, in the final 6 months of year two, or, years 3 and 4 can be just a challenge. Year one is when you need to get stuff done. A consistent thing that we've seen, whether it's Obama, Trump, Biden, that first year really means a lot. And so you talk about the tariffs. I think how those tariffs are handled, what the impact of those tariffs will be on our economy will have a huge impact on how voters look at this midterm election next year. And, you just talk about the big, beautiful bill. I mean, Medicaid. I mean, that's a very big component of that bill. It's something that's getting a lot of attention, and we'll have to see what the Senate does with the bill. But how Medicaid is situated once this reconciliation process is ended, that will be another piece of the puzzle in the 2026 midterms. You think about Biden, they had a very robust agenda in that first 100 days, big legislative focus. But the other thing that happened in that first year, and around August, was the withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Right.
And my sense from covering it was that you had that Afghanistan withdrawal, and then you had higher prices, inflation. And those two things came together, around the end of the summer of that first year, think Labor Day, and Biden's approval ratings declined and never really recovered.
You're right.
So I think we're just in a really consequential period right now for Trump. I think there are a lot of impressions that are being made among voters. And I think, ultimately, these voters are going to look at these policies and say, well, how do they affect me? How do they affect my pocketbook? And all of that will be part of the stew, I think, when we get, around to, say, a year from now, when we're much more in the throes of the midterm cycle.
Right. And I think that, and you bring up rightly so, the Afghanistan withdrawal. And I think that people probably won't appreciate what that withdrawal would have meant during the Biden years, probably until 5 or 10 years in the future, because they think about, sadly and tragically, the 13 service members who died, the chaotic withdrawal. Obviously, whether it would have been Biden or Trump or any other person who oversaw that withdrawal, nobody under any circumstances wanted to see 13 innocent people killed. And I think that that's what's ingrained in voters' minds, and the chaos that ensued. And whether right before Trump left office, the withdrawal date that him and his team had negotiated, and was it on par with what the Biden administration would have ideally hoped for? And then when the withdrawal actually happened and occurred, we saw the chaos. And I think that Biden's position was, he did not want to, and he spoke about this publicly, he did not want to hand off the Afghanistan war, if you will, to a future president. He wanted to finally end it. And so from a hindsight's perspective, it's going to be interesting what that will mean 5 to 10 years down the line. And I think that when you have a robust economy, Ken, it's very hard, and an economist would be able to speak eloquently about this, right? But you and I have a strong working knowledge and understanding of how the economy works as well, that when you have a robust economy and when you have a lot of jobs being created and it's revving up those economic drivers, those economic engines, it's hard to create 16 million jobs but have low inflation. I mean, it would be interesting to have that conversation with economists, that how do you have an economy that creates 16 million jobs, and whether or not you want to kind of parse out those jobs and say, well, what were recovery jobs and what were new jobs when people lost them during COVID, but how you can have low inflation rather, and lower prices when the buck is going to be passed off to consumer, and these corporations who are, there are greedy corporate American type of people running these companies who are going to say, you know what, business is booming, but we want people to buy our products and we're going to raise prices because it's all about making profits. Then that's a whole different discussion about, was that inflation that was seen in those prices in these grocery stores, in these places where people are having to buy product, was that kind of like artificially raised, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, the context is everything. And in coming out of COVID, we have seen leaders from around the world lose their jobs because of this unhappiness that people had, with their circumstances. And I think, managing the economy as it was coming out of COVID, it was, I think, historically will just be one of the toughest challenges that Biden faced. They would argue that they created jobs, they tried to manage the supply chain in an effective way. But inflation is just one of those insipid things that it can be very hard to control once it gets going. And, history will show it can be very successful in taking out political futures,
Sure.
as we saw in the 70s.
Yeah.
So I think, that it'll be, one of the things that Biden is judged on, I think, as history goes forward. I mean, I think, you bring up Afghanistan. I mean, I think they feel history will judge Biden differently on Afghanistan because his team would argue that, he did the right thing, that he knew it was likely to be a difficult process, but that he just, did not want to continue this war. He did not want to hand it over to another president. But in the short term, there were certainly repercussions for that decision.
And do you think there'll be ripple effects so far in Trump's second term where hundreds of thousands of people losing their jobs because of shrinking the government? Or did Doge set out what they were supposed to do, and were they still able to find the waste, fraud, and abuse that they thought they were going to find? And even if
Yeah.
they did find some of that waste, fraud, and abuse, let's say the billions of dollars that they probably or have confirmed that they've saved the federal government, does it pale in comparison into the narrative that was on the campaign trail, permeating throughout the campaign trail, that it was going to not just be something in a vacuum that, Doge did for 3-4 months under, Elon Musk, and that it's something that you can build on for the future? Did the ends justify the means, so to speak? And, just seeing the reshaping of our government and the money that was lost in the stock market when the tariffs started, and a lot of people getting hurt very quickly financially in the first 100 days of the Trump administration. Are Republicans not really taking those, issues into account come midterms? Because midterms is going to be late next year. We're sitting in almost June of 2025. The damage to some of these people's lives that occurred in the last 2-3 months, although sometimes in some respects people tend to look forward and not backward, but when it comes to their wallets, when it comes to their livelihoods, when it comes to losing jobs that they've had in the federal government for years and then have to start over, I don't know. And it'd be interesting, as a journalist for the Wall Street Journal, it'd be interesting to think about that. Come midterms, are Republicans not taking those, facts into account?
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how Doge is perceived in, say, Labor Day of 2026. I think generally speaking, the public seems to be supportive of the idea of reducing the size of government to, stopping, quote unquote, waste, fraud, and abuse, and spending less money on government. They do seem to be unhappy, though, with the execution that they've seen so far. And we certainly have seen, personal approval ratings of Elon Musk go down. There's been an impact on the view of his companies as well. But, will people feel the same way in a year from now or 15 months from now? That's hard to know. And, we'll have to see just really what the impact of these cuts are through Doge. Do people start seeing diminished services? Do people get their Social Security checks in a timely manner, or is there a disruption of that? Can retired military veterans, can they get the treatment they need at the local VA center? Are they having trouble getting their appointments? All of those things will matter on the ground. But I don't know that we're far enough along in this Doge story to really know how that's going to turn out. And we also don't really know, ultimately, if the savings that Doge has identified, it's roughly 170 billion that they've identified in savings, is that going to be cemented in the budget process? We're still in the middle of this budget process. At this point, Musk set a goal of about $1 trillion in cuts. We really haven't gotten to that point. So I think you have to give a lot of this an incomplete grade, really. And I don't know that we really know yet what the impact will be. It certainly has been one of the biggest stories of the Trump administration, the second go around in these first few months. But I think we're still trying to see how it still settles out.
Sure. And I think people can appreciate that anybody, whether you are a Democrat, Republican, Independent, eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse is a good thing. Having people, not live in our country who are here illegally, unless, and again, this goes from a policy perspective, what the Democratic Party has done or has tried to do with Republican support is find a pathway to citizenship for a lot of undocumented immigrants, something that Ronald Reagan championed, 40 years ago publicly, that, they pay taxes and they, if they're law abiding and they're contributing to our economy, hopefully there's a way for them to find a pathway to citizenship. But you have to do that legislatively. If you do it through executive order and, with these deportations, which again, another topic for another day. Again, everybody wants to live in a safe country. Everybody wants to have a strong economy. Everybody, I would hope, wants to have access to affordable health care and be able to go to the best schools or provide the best education for their children and have economic, fulfilling careers. And so I know that you have spent extra time with me, and I know that we were going to keep a certain limit. And thank you so much for being a little bit flexible. I mean, this is really fascinating, so I appreciate the extra time. Before we depart from our interview, final thoughts on any one topic we discussed, and final thoughts on relationship building in a team environment, and what you hope you see from a relationship building standpoint that you see, whether it's in this administration or future administrations, what can be improved on, because we live in such a divided, divisive time, right? And so it's been like that for many years, and really going back, I believe, to the Tea Party movement, because prior to that, during the Clinton years and the Reagan years, you could have supporters on both sides for any one particular president or one particular candidate. And I think we need to get back to a more moderate way of looking at the world, or middle down the road way of looking at the world, not black and white. So the floor is yours as we spend the final moments before we depart from our interview.
Yeah, I think on that, I think just as reporters, you just have to always try to be an honest broker with people and be willing to meet with anybody, whether, no matter what their political view is. It just helps to be on the Hill and meeting some of these new members of Congress, or maybe ones that are critical of media. Try to meet with them too and get to know them and understand where they're coming from. So I always just encourage younger reporters to just try to just be willing to have coffee with anybody and try to understand where they're coming from. I would say on the relationship side of things, I mean, sometimes I get asked by younger people in school who are looking to go into journalism about breaking in. One thing I would encourage young people, if they're watching this podcast, is to not feel like they can't email someone they see on the news, an anchor or a reporter, or someone who maybe they view as being in a high position, because like in all likelihood that person was helped along by someone else. And most of the people I know are very willing to help someone who's looking to break into journalism. So I would encourage young people to not be bashful and to just email that person and see, can I talk to you on the phone? Can I get a sense of how the path that you took to get to where you are? I think generally speaking, we're all willing to do that for people because someone helped us along the way. And so I think those relationships you build are, when you start out, are incredibly important. And I think there's generally within our field, there's an interest in helping the next generation come forward.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Ken, for being with me today on the WaveCapital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment, a national political reporter for the Wall Street Journal, formerly of the Associated Press, Georgetown University and Columbia University graduate. Thanks so much for being my guest on episode 66. And I look forward to our conversation airing on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and all streaming platforms, wherever you get your podcast. And thanks so much again.
Hey, sounds good. Thanks, Gary. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ken. You take care.
Take care.